So in this video, we're going to be talking about managing your project source code using Git and GitHub and submitting it to the CodePath portal. Now, all CodePath projects must be in GitHub and submitted through the portal, so it's important to know, but it's also really a survival skill at this point for any engineer. Git is by far the most popular version control system available. And if you're not familiar with version control systems or VCS, and I'm talking about things like Subversion or CVS, these support managing all of the files associated with your project at the change level. So whenever you make a change to a file, you can commit that change to source control or a version control system. And then at a later point, you can recover the file as of that change. In fact, you can look at the entire project at a certain point of time or as of a certain change. So for managing really large code bases, a version control system is really important. Now, the thing that's different about Git than most version control systems is that Git is fully distributed. So in other systems, you'd have a central repository that is the single point of truth that you have to interact with and sync with. But with Git, everybody maintains their own complete copy of a repository. And so locally, you'll be working with a complete copy of a repository that might also exist on GitHub. So one of the differences to keep in mind is that Git is the version control system. It's the software that actually accomplishes this functionality, whereas GitHub is simply the public web-based hosting platform. It supports all of Git's features, it wraps Git, and it actually supports a lot of additional features like project management and issue tracking, forking, and a lot of visual editing features. So GitHub is really valuable and powerful, but it is separate from Git, which is really, you could think of it as the protocol, the underlying software. That said, you will hear a lot of people refer to Git and GitHub kind of interchangeably. And so for the purposes of this video, think of them as almost interchangeable, even though it's important to remember that they are two distinct things. In this course, we will be using Git via GitHub almost exclusively. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can interact with Git and GitHub. The first one to mention is the command line interface. It really is the gold standard. And this is when you are interacting with Git via a terminal window by typing in commands. And really, for mastering Git, at least a certain amount of proficiency with the command line is required. So we will be covering that later in the video. You can also use the github.com web interface, and it really is impressive how much you can do on github.com just via the browser. You can create files, edit them, delete them, but you can also do very complex things such as resolving merge conflicts directly in your browser. It's also a really great way to get to know Git. So we'll check that out a little bit too. In addition, there are Git desktop clients that GitHub publishes. These are native clients for specific OSs like Mac or Windows that give you kind of a graphical way to manage your repository and issue Git commands directly from your local machine. There are also a number of third-party clients such as Git Kraken that do the same thing that some people prefer. But the last one that I'll mention is the Android Studio plugin. And Android Studio actually has really robust support for Git right out of the box. You can see a lot of the commands integrated via the VCS drop-down menu, and we'll be using some of them in order to manage our project. So one of the things that is important to remember here is that you don't want to get locked into any one specific way of using Git. You want to have at least a certain amount of proficiency with the command line, but then it's good to understand a lot of the concepts so that you can use Git in different contexts and through some of these different interfaces. So if you're new to Git or GitHub or version control systems in general, then there's a good bit of terminology that you need to absorb in order to understand how Git works and how to work with it. So we're going to cover a few of the principal terms here. And we'll start with repository, which is really the basic unit of currency in Git. A repository is simply a collection of related files and their revision history. So every project that you submit in this course will need its own repository, and the To-Do app will need a repository as well. A revision is basically an individual change to a file or set of files. And this is also referred to as a commit. And we can talk about examining a file's content as of a certain revision or as of a certain commit. But it's basically the individual item that is tracked for each file in Git. A clone is a copy of a repository that lives on your local computer, whereas a remote is a copy of a repository that lives on a server such as github.com. So when you are dealing with Git, it's important to remember that you will often have multiple copies of a single repository. You may have a clone that is on your local machine, and then you may have a remote that lives on github.com. And those two won't necessarily be in sync all the time. And so a lot of the process of using Git is understanding when and how to sync clones and remotes. These are both full-fledged GitHub repositories, but we generally call the local copy a clone and the remote copy a remote. In addition, you'll need to understand branching. A branch is basically a parallel version of a repository that is usually used to support isolated changes. Every repository has at least one branch, and that's usually called master. And it may be that you never need to use more than master for projects that you are working on individually. But often in large projects with multiple collaborators, separate branches will be created to isolate change. Someone may be working on a feature that impacts a file, and another person may be working on another feature that impacts the same file in a different way. And a branch allows them to work in isolation, but also lets them come back together at some point and merge their changes. A fork is actually a personal copy of another user's repository that lives on your GitHub account. A fork is really something only that exists in GitHub. It's not part of core Git, but it's a really useful way for taking someone else's code and making your own changes to it and kind of maintaining your own separate version of it. There's a GitHub glossary that we have linked here that goes over more terms, and as you use Git, you'll understand more about what each of these words mean. And from this point forward, you will need access to your github.com account. So if you haven't already, go ahead and create a public account on github.com for use with the rest of this video before proceeding. In Android Studio, we're going to use the VCS integration to bootstrap the creation of a repository for our SimpleTodo project. We'll use the VCS menu from the drop-down menu, go to Import into Version Control, and then choose Share Project on GitHub. You will need to authenticate to GitHub the first time, so go ahead and enter your username and password, and then click Login. Also, the first time you'll need to set up a master password. This is the password that Android Studio uses locally to protect your stored passwords. Again, you only have to do this once, but go ahead and pick a password to use with Android Studio. The next dialog that comes up is the Share Project on GitHub. This is actually creating the remote repository, so you need to pick a name. SimpleTodo works as well. And you need to pick a remote name. This is what the remote repository will be aliased as on your local system, and origin is the default. So just select the defaults for these first two fields. You can also enter a description of the repository at this point, so just enter SimpleTodo app and click Share. GitHub will by default share everything in the project that it knows it shouldn't ignore. Examples of files that could be ignored are things like class files, anything that is produced by the Gradle build, anything that can be recreated from source. Those are the kinds of things that you would not share on Git, and the mechanism for not sharing on Git is to ignore. So everything else inside the project will be shared by default from Android Studio. So you can accept the defaults here, and then you can use a commit message. An initial commit is as good as any. It's good to review the list though and make sure that you're not sharing anything inadvertent, such as sensitive data. When you're satisfied, go ahead and click OK. At this point, Android Studio is creating the repositories locally and remotely and pushing the files to the remote on GitHub. When it's done, a successful notification pops up with a link to the repository on GitHub, and if you click that, a browser should open and take you to your repository's home page, where you can review all of the files that were just pushed. Now, what might not be obvious at this point, since Android Studio automated most of the process for us, is that there are actually two repositories. There's the one we have locally on our local machine at the same location in the file system as our Android Studio project. That was created by Android Studio as part of the process. And there's the remote one, this one that I'm looking at through the browser right now. changes made to the remote repository must be pulled to the local one, and changes made to the local repository or committed to the local repository must be pushed to this remote. So we're going to demonstrate that workflow from both ends at this point, as well as some of GitHub's really cool editing tools. So we'll start by creating a README. You can see this banner down here. A README is strongly suggested for any repository that you share on GitHub. So we'll go ahead and click that button, and this will create a new file within our remote repository. And we can start adding all kinds of content here. And the format used for this particular file is Markdown, which is what the MD extension means. All of the READMEs that you'll be submitting for this project will have to be in Markdown, but GitHub actually provides a really cool way to edit Markdown, and then you can preview what the Markdown looks like. Markdown, if you don't know, is a very simple, almost plain text format for rendering content over the web. So you can think about it as a very lightweight way to write things that can be rendered as HTML. For instance, you see this SimpleTodo is basically an HTML heading. It corresponds to the h1 tag in HTML, if you're familiar with that, and this is just body text. So if I preview that, I'd see a large SimpleTodo with an anchor link and then some text below it. So you can use this to, even if you don't know Markdown, work with the syntax and work with the GitHub editing tool to understand how to put the information that you want into this file. Now, to make it easier to get started using Markdown and these READMEs, for all of the projects in this course, we have provided template README files. So I'll go ahead and pull up the SimpleTodo README template. And you can see this is just raw Markdown that you can copy and paste into your README to get started. So I'll go ahead and do that now. I'll copy this and then I'll paste it into this editor pane in github.com. And then you can go right away to the preview pane and see what it looks like. So you can see there are a number of things that we left blank or generic that you'll need to fill out. And then down along the user stories section, you can see checkboxes against each of the items that are required or optional to implement. And you need to change these to check to indicate which ones you completed. Additionally, you can embed a video walkthrough, an animated GIF video walkthrough, and we'll cover how to do that in a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and fill out some of these. So I'll switch back to the editor tab, and the name of the app is SimpleTodo. And I'll go ahead and change that here as well. I'll add my name and indicate about the number of hours you spent on this. And then for each of these checkboxes, you can change them to check by adding an X in the middle. So for instance, we did successfully implement add and remove from the list, so I'm going to change that from an empty checkbox to a checked one. We did not implement an edit screen, so I'm going to leave that unchecked, but we did implement persistence between restarts, so I'm going to go ahead and check that one too. I could go through the rest of them and specify, and I could add anything else that I wanted to about the app here as well, but I'll start with that for now, and we'll create a README this way. So down at the bottom, you'll see this commit dialog, and you can just accept the default message to begin with, and this will commit this README file directly to the master branch. So I hit commit. It should take me back to my repository page, and you can see that it has now embedded the README into the main page of the repository. So a few important things to note here. We created this file on github.com, so this file currently only exists in the remote repository. This file does not exist locally. And so the first thing that I'll need to do is sync my local with these changes. And to do that, I will switch back to Android Studio and pull them using the VCS integration. So back here in the studio, from the VCS drop-down menu, you'll see a Git submenu now because we have associated this project with Git, and we can go down to the pull option. We'll ask us to confirm some basic details that we're pulling from the origin, which is the remote, and it gives you the link here. So you can just accept the defaults in this case and click pull. We'll also ask you if you want to add the VCS configuration to Git. This might not be a good idea if you are tracking sensitive information in the file, but in order to make things simple, you can say yes if you like. So you see the console has opened up down on the bottom of the screen that indicates one file was pulled, and that is the README. So this is exactly what we would expect. So we've already started completing the README by marking the optional and required stories that we completed, but there's one big piece that's missing. And you probably saw the link on the README to the video walkthrough. This needs to be submitted with every project that goes through the CodePath portal. So it's really important to record this walkthrough, and you can use LiceCap to record it. You can also use other software such as Recordit is another one that we like, but LiceCap works very well, so we'll go ahead and show how to do one of these videos through LiceCap. The first thing I'm going to do is minimize Android Studio and then load LiceCap. You can see LiceCap is basically just a frame, and everything inside the frame is what's being recorded in the walkthrough. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring up the emulator and align LiceCap to the emulator so that it captures all of the emulator content. This doesn't have to be exact, but enough to show. All right. And so at this point, I want to load up Android Studio again and click Run to start the app. And you can see the app is framed by LiceCap. So in LiceCap, and you may need to click the bar in LiceCap to bring it to the front, you want to hit the record button. And then you want to navigate to your project folder on your local drive. So that's going to be, and if you don't see the full settings here, you can click this little chevron to expand this dialog to show you where you are, and then it will be under Android Studio Projects and SimpleTodo, and then I'm just going to call it walkthrough. So I'll save it as walkthrough in the root directory of my project. Now it's recording, so I can go ahead and use the app. I'll click on the emulator and I'll type something new. That shows the add, so then I'll hit this and show the delete. Then I can do a few different things at this point. I can pause it, and if I need to do some work in the background, I can do that. You can also use the controls here within the emulator to show stopping and starting. So I'm going to unpause, I'm going to stop the app, and then I'm going to reload it, and this shows that the changes were persisted. And then I can stop the recording. It may take you a few times to get this down, but you should be able to come up with an animated GIF that's not that big that shows all of the optional and required stories that you implemented. If you need to break it into multiple GIFs, that's fine too. But at this point, I have a walkthrough.gif on the file system that I need to connect to github.com, and so I need to commit this file and then push it. And so we'll do that from the command line next. So to begin with, I can close LiceCap and minimize the emulator. Now I want to open the terminal, and if you don't have the terminal on your dock, you can find it by a spotlight. You can just type in terminal, and we'll open a terminal. If you want to, once it's in the dock, you can right-click on it and select Options Keep in Dock for easier reference later. The terminal by default will open to your home directory. So if I type in pwd, it should show that I'm in my home directory. And then I would expect to see the Android Studio Projects folder within that. Sure enough, there it is. So I can cd into Android Studio Projects. And I expect to see the SimpleTodo app directory. And sure enough, it's there. So I'll cd into that as well. Now if I list files in this directory, I would expect to see, among other things, my walkthrough GIF. And so there it is. At this point, I want to make sure that the SimpleTodo project is connected to Git properly through the command line. We know that it's connected properly to GitHub via Android Studio, but the command line interface sometimes requires a little bit of additional setup. So one of the things I'm going to do first is type git status. Now, if you haven't installed the Git command line client, you'll get an error at this point, and you will need to go back and install it. So make sure that the Git command line interface is installed. And when you type git status, you should see a message similar to this. It tells us that we are on branch master, which is to be expected, and then we're up to date with origin master. Again, origin is the alias for the remote, so Git is telling us that our branch is up to date with the remote repository. But then it also lists a couple of untracked files. And untracked files to Git are simply files that occur in the clone that are not officially tracked through source control. They're generally one of two things that we can do with an untracked file. We can either ignore it, and we do that for something like a build artifact, something that is ephemeral and gets recreated with the build, or we can add it to the repository so that Git can start tracking it, and that's what we want to do here. So we see there are two untracked files here. You can ignore the VCSXML file. We're interested in walkthrough.gif, which we obviously want to add to source control. Before that, it's worth taking a moment and making sure that our Git command line interface is configured properly. So one of the things I'm going to do next, and I'm just going to type clear here to get some room in the terminal, I can type git config -- global user.name. This lets me verify the name that I have configured to use Git with, and you can see nothing gets output, so I need to specify this. So I'm going to hit up arrow to get the same command again, and then pass it one extra argument, and that is my GitHub username. Now I can type the first command again, and it echoes my GitHub username. So the second thing I need to do is make sure that my email is configured properly. So I'm going to go through the same thing. I'm going to do git config -- global user.email. Nothing is echoed, and that means that my email isn't configured properly. So once again, I'm hitting up arrow in the terminal to get the last command that was run. And then I'm just amending it by adding the value that I want to specify, which in this case is the email address associated with my GitHub account. So I hit enter again, and then I can run this command up here, git config global user email, and make sure that it is configured properly. To get back there, I'm just hitting up arrow twice, and this lets you revisit commands that you've already issued through the history. So I'm going to hit that again, and now we see that my global user email is configured properly and my global user name is configured properly. So now I can actually push the file to Git. So let's go through the process. I'm going to type clear again, and then I'm going to add the file to the repository using the git add command. I'm going to pass it the name of the file that I want to add, which in this case is walkthrough.gif. There's no feedback for that command, so I can proceed straight to commit, git commit, and then the -m flag lets you specify a commit message, so you can say what the commit is all about. And then enter. Tells me that walkthrough.gif has been added to the repository, and so now this file is being tracked. If I type git status again, I should not see that it's untracked. And you can see it's not untracked now. The only untracked file is this VCSXML, which again we can ignore. It is telling me though that my branch is now ahead of origin master by one commit, and that makes sense. I just added and committed the walkthrough GIF, and so now my branch locally is one commit ahead of the remote repository. In order to make the remote repository come up to date with my local branch, I need to do a git push. So I'm going to do that now. Just type git push. Now Git will use a network and connect to GitHub and actually push this commit to the remote repository. So at this point, I should be able to go back to my GitHub page in the browser, and if I reload it, I can see that the walkthrough is now present in the repository. It was added just a minute ago. So you can take a look at the walkthrough.gif here, or you can just embed it into the README. Sometimes it won't show if the GIF is too big, but in this case we're under the limit, so you can see the animated GIF walkthrough that we just recorded using LiceCap. So this is great. We can now just embed this directly into the README. So I'll go back to the README file by clicking on it in the browser, And then I can use the GitHub edit feature, this little pen right here. This again lets me edit the file directly on GitHub, and this way I can take advantage of the Markdown preview. So since the walkthrough is in our repository, there's a very easy way to connect with it. I will take this URL that is not pointing anywhere, and I'll replace it with walkthrough GIF. Since it's in the root of the repository, then GitHub should be able to resolve that and embed it right in the Markdown. I'll add a commit message. And just to reiterate, I'm committing directly to the remote repository here. So once I make this change, the remote repository will be ahead of my local repository. And now you can see the video is showing up on the README, which is nice because you can go to the project homepage and get a view of exactly what the app does. So now I can switch back to the terminal if I want and pull that change back in. So just to be clear, we created the GIF locally, committed it, and then pushed it to the remote repository. But then we just updated the README again remotely, and so to pull that change in, I would just issue a git pull command. And now you can see that the README file has changed, and that change has been applied locally. So we're all up to date. So now we are almost ready to submit. The next thing to do would be to go through the README file one more time and make sure that you mark all of the stories that you completed with the checkbox as being completed, and make sure that any GIFs are linked or embedded, and any notes that you want to specify you can include on the README as well. You can edit the README directly on GitHub as we have been doing, but once you are ready to submit, you can open the course portal and use the assignment tab to submit the project. So I'll show you how to do that now. Let's go to the overview day 1 page. And then we'll click on the assignment tab. And then we'll click the submit button. That'll ask us for a few pieces of information. The GitHub project URL is the same URL we have over here in the other tab, so I'll just copy and paste that in. You can either drag and drop a link to the GIF, or you can just specify the URL, and since it's here in the repository, I'll just get the URL directly. I can click on the walkthrough GIF, and then the URL is in the URL bar, so I'll paste that in as well. I'll specify the number of hours spent. You can add any notes, and then click Submit when you are ready. Once the project has been submitted, we receive a notification to begin reviewing it. But you can still keep making changes at this point. Just be sure to push them to your GitHub repository so that we see the latest code when we review your project. This is the basic process that you will follow to submit projects throughout the course.